In recent weeks and even months, you can hear the overused cliché that the negotiation process between Ukraine and Russia has been stopped, frozen, put on pause. Call it whatever you want. Apparently, it's all due to each side's tough, uncompromising stance. However, few people ask themselves the question, were there ever any real negotiations at all? Or was what we've been witnessing since last spring nothing more than a farce? A performance staged to satisfy the needs of a single actor, the one currently sitting in the White House. So today, we will sum up the interim results of the Russian-Ukrainian negotiations, which have lasted for about a year. We will analyze what real results have been achieved over the past year and what ended in failure. We will examine the positions of each side and what influences them. We will also look at the United States' place and role in this negotiation process. And finally, we will try to understand whether there will be any practical outcome from all this fuss, at least in the short term. My name is Semyon, this is the Mega Show TV channel. We provide only the clearest and most balanced analysis of events. Let's get started. When do they sit down at the negotiating table? To begin with, I think it's worth remembering that for almost 3 years of Russia's full-scale war with Ukraine, there have been no official negotiations between the warring states. Yes, in March 2022, there were lengthy negotiations in Istanbul, but they ended after evidence of atrocities committed by Russian occupiers was discovered in Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanka, and other settlements near Kyiv. At that time, the Ukrainian leadership decided not to make any compromises and to continue fighting against the group of murderers, rapists, and looters, who can only loosely be called the armed forces of the Russian Federation. This went on for 3 long years, but in the spring of 2025, everything changed dramatically. The question is why? A year ago, in one of my videos, I already touched on this question a little and came up with a sort of universal formula, a formula that would guarantee successful conduct and completion of negotiations. Therefore, I suggest we consider all further questions from this perspective. So, in my opinion, for successful completion of negotiations between 2 warring sides, at least one of the 3 mentioned factors needs to come into play. First, the warring sides should have at least some convergence of positions to form a basis for further compromise. Secondly, one or both sides would have to face resource exhaustion. And then the military and political leadership of the warring states would realize the futility of continuing the hostilities any further. In that case, the hot phase of the war would turn into a cold one, just like it happened during the Korean War. A classic frozen conflict, nothing more. And the third option is the complete military defeat of one of the sides. Here, everything is extremely simple and clear. Now let's look at the situation a year earlier, specifically in the context of this formula. Were the warring countries, and first of all Russia as the aggressor and initiator of this war, really ready for a compromise? Of course not. Putin and all his Chekist henchmen were determined to continue the war no matter the casualties. Remember how the Kremlin's paid propagandists kept repeating that the goals of the special military operation would be achieved no matter what. Despite Ukraine being ready for a ceasefire along the current front line, essentially freezing the conflict like the Korean scenario. Now let's consider the second factor. Have Ukraine or Russia, or both, completely exhausted their resources? Nothing of the sort. Despite a number of objective difficulties and general public fatigue from the prolonged war, both warring countries still have plenty of material and human resources to continue the war. Although this may sound somewhat harsh and cynical, it is a fact. Unfortunately, these are the realities of war. Moreover, in recent years, Ukraine has significantly increased the capabilities of its own military-industrial complex, especially in the production of drones of various modifications. And Russia, in turn, with the help of its shadow fleet and other shady schemes, has increased the export of energy resources and the purchase of restricted technologies with the foreign currency it earned. As for the complete military defeat of one of the sides, I have nothing to comment on here. At least because neither last year's nor the current situation at the front shows anything like that, even in the foreseeable future. The drone war, or as experts are increasingly calling it, War 4, is making the battlefield absolutely transparent. That's why deep breakthroughs in the Zhukov style are completely unrealistic in our time, at least until some grand technological innovation is invented that can change this positional deadlock. General Zaluzhny wrote about this phenomenon 3 years ago, and since then, little has changed. What goals did the negotiators set for themselves? In such a situation, a very reasonable question arises. Why did Russia and Ukraine still sit down at the negotiating table if none of the factors mentioned actually worked or are working? The answer should be sought across the ocean, in Washington, in the White House. After all, many have already somewhat forgotten, but the promise to end the Russia-Ukraine war in 24 hours was one of Donald Fredovich's main campaign points. Then, after the victory and inauguration, those 24 hours gradually turned into a week, months, 50 days, and now it's already gone into the second year. But back then, in the early days of his presidency, Trump's pressure was so powerful that neither Kyiv nor Moscow could withstand him. Each side, for its own reasons, decided to resume the stalled talks. And reluctantly, they were forced to sit down at the negotiating table. However, at this notorious negotiating table, both Ukraine and Russia were actually pursuing their own goals. To understand how this situation develops, we need to analyze them carefully. Let's begin with Kyiv. The Ukrainian authorities did not hide and said directly that the most optimal option under the current circumstances was to freeze the military conflict along the existing front line. The main priority was a ceasefire. At the same time, the Ukrainian negotiators, having learned from bitter experience, tried not to anger the already very impulsive and unpredictable Trump. It was precisely this fear of losing already shaky American support that became an obsession for Ukraine. Moreover, the $61 billion aid package from Biden was almost completely exhausted by that time. But for Putin, the obsession was to continue the war. To finally crush Ukraine, but at the same time camouflage it in such a way as not to anger Trump either. And if possible, to achieve at least a partial lifting of sanctions which, although slowly, were weakening the economic potential of the aggressor. That is why, from Moscow to Washington, almost the entire 25th year streams of flattery toward the American president poured in through all official and unofficial channels. But at the same time, Russia did not take any practical actions that would indicate real intentions to end the war. Not once. They were just feeding Trump nonsense. Empty promises and assurances of eternal friendship. The very level of the people who were assigned to handle these negotiations shows that Moscow had no real intention of seriously negotiating an end to the hostilities. First and foremost, this is the former Minister of Culture, assistant and favorite historian of Putin, Vladimir Medinsky, who for the past 20 years has not been doing real historical scholarship, but in outright historical propaganda, and of extremely poor quality at that. In fact, he has become the unofficial ideologist of the Kremlin, defending historical truth, traditional values, and spiritual bonds from the corrupting influence of the West. He's like a Suslov during the Brezhnev era, but with much more modest authority. He's not even allowed near Putin's Politburo. But even further removed from the world of real diplomacy is the second negotiator, the CEO of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, Kirill Dmitriev. His only significant achievement was that, at one time, he very successfully married a certain Natalia Popova, the closest friend of Putin's daughter, Ekaterina Tikhonova. This allowed him, if not to enter the inner circle of the autocrat, then at least to become an overseer of various grey schemes that were set up to circumvent numerous sanctions. He also had certain connections among Donald Trump's business partners and relatives, particularly with Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. By the way, Dmitriev, like Medinsky, is originally from Ukraine, which also played a significant role in choosing a negotiator. Putin, as a professional security officer, skillfully manipulates such things, emphasizing his supposedly favorable attitude toward Ukrainians. Like, we're fighting against the neo-Nazi Kyiv regime, but not against ordinary people. See, for example, there are Ukrainians even among our leadership, and in general, Ukrainians are just like Russians, well, just a little spoiled. There's nothing new here. This is a well-known tactic since ancient times, divide and conquer, so the level of the Russian negotiators was weak from the very beginning. If the Kremlin had been set on serious constructive negotiations, they would have sent at least Mr. Horseface, Foreign Minister Lavrov, especially since it's his direct responsibility to handle diplomacy, or someone else from Saltselikov's inner circle. When Putin needed to avoid escalating nuclear confrontation with the US in 2022 and 2023, he used the same heavyweights of Russian politics as communication channels, Security Council head Patrushev and Foreign Intelligence Service chief Narishkin. And in the case of Ukraine, as a famous character from Operation Y would say, it's not serious. And the very first direct Russian-Ukrainian contacts already showed that Russia was not going to make any compromises. However, as the Americans say, step by step, let's take it one thing at a time. The play in Istanbul in 3 acts. I will deliberately not consider all the contacts between the US and Russia over the past year. Sometimes Dmitriev flew to America, sometimes Witkoff to Moscow. Occasionally, the latter was even honored by the presence of the Orthodox Tsar himself. They whispered about something behind the scenes, but since there were no serious results, most of these deals were as empty as a drum. Therefore, I will focus only on the most significant contacts. And first of all, of course, these are the Russian-Ukrainian negotiations in Istanbul. They took place in 3 rounds, May 16th, June 2nd, and July 23, 2025, and with the direct cooperation of the Turkish side. Why Istanbul? It's clear. It was in this city that most of the negotiations took place in March 2022, and it was there that the preliminary draft agreements were agreed upon. By insisting on Turkey, Russia highlighted that these were not new negotiations, but simply a continuation of the previous ones. For Ukraine, some kind of European platform like Geneva would have been more desirable. When there are no fish, even a crayfish will do. Without other options, Iraq, Crimea, and especially Turkey remain key trading partners for Ukraine. Recall the 2022 grain deal. When the formal ceremony ended and the real negotiations began, it immediately became clear what many experts had warned about before. Moscow's categorical unwillingness to make any concessions or find common ground. And without searching for common ground, any diplomacy is inevitably doomed to fail. From the very first minutes of the negotiations, the Russian delegation demonstrated that it was not interested in seeking anything constructive and, through Medinsky, simply relayed Putin's ultimatums, most of which were completely unrealistic. How did this look in practice? The Ukrainian diplomats, led by Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, insisted specifically on a ceasefire first, and only then on considering all other issues, including territorial ones. In other words, they advocated for freezing the conflict along the front line. This is exactly what negotiators have always done throughout history. If a war reached a stalemate and neither side had the strength to completely defeat the enemy, first the bloodshed would be stopped and then all the other diplomatic maneuvers would follow. The most recent example of this is the US and Israel's war with Iran. First comes the ceasefire, then the negotiations. Simple and clear. But Russia has taken an unbreakable position. No ceasefires, no freezing the conflict. We sign a peace treaty right away. And for this, from the point of view of the all-Russian autocracy, it is necessary to eliminate the so-called root causes of the war. And we already know very well what these root causes are. These are the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych and Ukraine's shift to a pro-Western course in 2014 and the eastward expansion of NATO. I have a separate video on my channel about the senselessness of these claims. Be sure to check it out. In fact, all these discussions about the root causes of the war are really about Russia's refusal to recognize the results of the Cold War and the collapse of the USSR, as well as the new international order that emerged afterward, especially in Eastern Europe. And again, by presenting this war as a forced defense against Western aggression, Putin deliberately keeps silent about the main factor, the desire of Ukraine itself to leave Moscow's sphere of influence. In the Kremlin's view, Ukraine lacks agency, and its desire to integrate with Europe is seen solely as a conspiracy by Washington. It is the Russian dictator's categorical unwillingness to accept the final loss of control over the former Soviet Republic that is the true root cause of the conflict. Therefore, it is not surprising that in Istanbul, Medinsky and his team put forward a number of conditions that can be described as a demand for Ukraine's capitulation. If not direct, then certainly a hidden one. In its draft memorandum, Russia set conditions for a ceasefire, either the withdrawal of Ukrainian armed forces from Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, or signing a roadmap that includes their withdrawal. The infamous denazification and demilitarization, with a mandatory limitation on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces and a ban on nationalist parties. An official renunciation of all territories annexed by Russia, including Crimea, as well as a neutral and non-nuclear status for Ukraine, the lifting of all sanctions imposed since 2014, and so on. What else is there to comment on? Unconditionally accepting such an ultimatum would not only mean a radical weakening of Ukraine's defense capability, but also a guaranteed internal civil conflict which in the long run could easily lead to the collapse of Ukrainian statehood. and Moscow would achieve by hybrid means what it has not been able to achieve on the battlefield for many years. As you can see, both sides had diametrically opposed positions. And when the Ukrainian side began insisting on organizing a personal meeting between Zelensky and Putin to discuss the most contentious demands, Medinsky immediately responded with a categorical refusal. He disguised it with various strange proposals aimed solely at further delaying the negotiations. Among them were the formation of working groups on political, humanitarian, and military issues that would operate online, as well as the introduction of short ceasefires along the front line, for a day or two, to collect the wounded and the dead. In short, the Istanbul negotiations of 2025 failed precisely because of Moscow's position. The draft memorandum on conflict resolution provided by Russia is essentially an ultimatum with deliberately impossible and absolutely humiliating conditions for Ukraine. Putin and his KGB mafia brothers are absolutely confident in their own military victory, and that's why they didn't even try to look for common ground, let alone make any real compromises. On the other hand, to be fair, I should note that this whole Istanbul saga did have some practical outcome. But it was purely humanitarian. It was during these negotiations that more prisoners returned home in the last 3 months than in the previous 3 years. Also, the remains of hundreds of fallen defenders of Ukraine were given the chance to be buried with dignity. But nothing more than that. No geopolitical issues were resolved. The spirit of Anchorage and what lies beneath it. Realizing that further direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia were pointless, Trump decided to intervene directly and arrange a face-to-face meeting with Putin. A high-level summit, which was already a major event in itself since the last meeting of this level was between Putin and Biden in Geneva in the summer of 2021. And after the start of the full-scale invasion, the US did everything possible to impose the toughest possible diplomatic isolation on the aggressive Kremlin dwarf. But also, Trump wouldn't be himself if he didn't understand America's entire previous strategy, and he himself was the first, which is somewhat humiliating in itself, to request a personal meeting with Putin. And to smooth things over a bit and not appear weak, he proposed a summit on his own territory in Anchorage, Alaska. The place for negotiations is in the middle of nowhere, but never mind, that's not the point. So the summit itself took place on August 15th of last year. And the whole world was watching it, especially in Ukraine. Many incompetent experts or simply short-sighted observers started pushing the narrative that that's it, it's happened. Yalta 2.0, the division of the world among three. Well, in this case, among two. There's a separate video on my channel about the possibility, or rather the impossibility, of a new Yalta conference. I'll just say this. The efficiency of the Anchorage summit, despite the powerful PR effect, turned out to be close to zero. You could even call it the Anchorage fizzle. And why? The answer is obvious. Because of the excessive ambitions and the Führer Nedoberko, which were skyrocketing not just by the day, but by the hour. And this is despite him lacking any real way to achieve the notorious goals of the special military operation. That's why he replaced reality with bluffing and empty promises. It became clear right in Anchorage that there would be no big deal, as Trump had previously announced. At the very least, because the talks lasted about 3 hours instead of the planned 6, and in the end, there was only a short joint press conference without any questions from journalists. The planned joint lunch between Trump and Putin was cancelled at the last moment, which, according to unwritten diplomatic traditions, clearly means failure and a lack of significant results. But most importantly, there was no signed agreement, not a single concrete document. There was no ceasefire deal because Russia didn't need one. The territorial dispute was not resolved because Putin demanded full legal recognition of control over the seized lands, including the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions within their administrative borders. And even Trump couldn't agree to something like that. But again, there were no recorded guarantees about Russia not attacking again or any kind of roadmap for achieving peace. But here's what did appear, a sort of Anchorage spirit. That's exactly how Kremlin propaganda labeled the results of the summit. And first and foremost, this meant narrowing Putin's demands to just the Donbass. Supposedly, as soon as the Ukrainian armed forces completely withdraw from the territory of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, that's it. Peace will come, and a triple hooray. But in reality, the demand to hand over Donbas without a fight is yet another diplomatic trap from the Kremlin, which is based on the crudest bait and switch. I want to emphasize this especially for those of our viewers who sincerely believe that the reason the war keeps going lies in these unfortunate remnants of the already half-destroyed Donbas. That's not the case at all. The Russian authorities quite openly have stated and continue to state that the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Donbas is only a necessary condition for a temporary ceasefire, and that's it. Moscow in no way is giving up its standard set of demands regarding Ukraine's neutral status and limitations on its armed forces. That is, in fact, demilitarization, a ban on nationalist parties, protection of the rights of the Russian language, the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, and other standard nonsense. Putin has repeatedly said, both before and after Anchorage, that without full control over Donbas, he does not consider it possible to even begin serious negotiations about a long-term peace, directly stating that either we will resolve this by military means or the Ukrainian troops will leave on their own. And in addition, there is always the trap of the officially annexed Crimea and the 4 regions of Ukraine. The great gatherer of Russian lands and all his cliques specifically wrote into their constitution even what they didn't actually control, for example, the city of Zaporizhzhia. Thus, a time bomb was planted and the detonator is triggered by a call from Putin's bunker. And even if, purely theoretically, Kiev ever agrees to voluntarily withdraw troops from Donbas and meet other demands, the card sharp named Moskva will immediately pull an ace out of its sleeve and say, "Give us Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions, because that's what is written in our constitution." And to give up Kherson, that would mean creating a bridgehead for an offensive towards Odessa and further cutting Ukraine off from the Black Sea. Which in practice means turning it into a non-functional puppet state, which is exactly what the Kremlin has been aiming for since February 2022. What do we have at this point? At this point, we can confidently state that the Anchorage bubble has completely disappeared, if it ever existed at all. Ukraine, with direct support from European countries, has categorically rejected any demands to surrender Donbas without a fight. And it immediately became clear that the much-desired big deal for Trump was simply impossible without serious concessions from Kiev, which the Ukrainian authorities simply cannot make. After Anchorage, the negotiations moved into a more routine phase. Official visits and phone calls between top officials followed one after another, but the situation never moved from a standstill. And the main factor in Russian-Ukrainian relations continued to be the dynamics on the battlefield. Whoever has the strength has the stronger negotiating position. And since the situation at the front still remains at a stalemate, and Moscow continues to insist on its maximalist demands, it means the negotiations continue to go nowhere. The last such round of diplomatic games took place in Geneva on February 17th to 18th, 2026. The previous two, also with representatives from the US, Ukraine and Russia, took place in Abu Dhabi on January 23rd to 24th and February 4th to 5th. And again, the results were next to nothing. Only the continuation of prisoner exchanges. Russia once again refused to drop its demands for full control over Donbas, and Ukraine refused to give up its territories. And the vague promises from the American side about some security guarantees, but only after the end of hostilities, don't really impress Kiev much. The experience of the long-forgotten Budapest Memorandum is a clear example of this. As the saying goes, promising doesn't mean marrying. Ukraine is also actively continuing to promote the idea of organizing a direct high-level meeting between Zelensky and Putin, believing that only the leaders can cut this Gordian knot. However, the Kremlin is blocking this initiative at every turn. They claim that such a meeting between the presidents makes no sense until the delegations at the lower level have signed draft documents that meet Moscow's requirements. They're basically demanding a preliminary surrender. The black swan called the war with Iran also contributed to the diplomatic track coming to a halt. Instead of taking Tehran in 3 days, Trump ended up with the Strait of Hormuz blocked and a prolonged energy crisis. So now he's busy with things he considers more important. The Russia-Ukraine war is somewhere on the periphery of his interests, especially since the situation hasn't changed significantly in the past few months. Russia believes that time is on its side and therefore sees no need to rush into negotiations. In turn, the Ukrainian leadership hopes to undermine the enemy's offensive potential in the prolonged battles for the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration, which has long been turned into a real fortress. And under such conditions, there is simply no point in discussing anything at the negotiating table. This is exactly what they think in Kyiv, Moscow, and Washington. Let's make predictions for the future. In my opinion, after some time, negotiations, or perhaps another imitation of them, will resume, especially closer to autumn, closer to the midterm elections for the US Congress. And I have already analyzed their importance for the further development of events in a separate video. In order to keep at least one chamber under Republican control, Trump desperately needs to show the average American some kind of positive result. And since the deal with Iran isn't working out, the Hormuz Strait is blocked, China clearly isn't going to make concessions on tariffs, and gas prices per gallon keep rising. Then the resumption of Russian-Ukrainian negotiations can be sold to the electorate as another major diplomatic victory for Donald Fredovich. But the effectiveness of such negotiations, to put it mildly, is extremely doubtful. The positions of the parties remain so infinitely far apart, and the negotiation process is complicated by ongoing military actions and mutual distrust. In the short term, the most likely scenario is the continuation of organic dialogue on humanitarian issues, while the deadlock on key political and military aspects remains. The Russian and Ukrainian delegations may agree on another exchange of prisoners and deceased bodies. Russia may also return some children forcibly deported from occupied territories at the start of the invasion. These are strictly humanitarian issues and nothing else. To achieve real diplomatic progress, either a significant change in the situation at the front will be required, or more active pressure from the US on Russia, including sanctions. What is Trump so strongly opposed to? Or for the worldview of the Russian leadership to radically change? A single change of the top leader might not be enough. As I mentioned earlier, Putinism in Russia can very well thrive even without Putin. That's all from me. Thank you for watching. Thanks to all the sponsors for supporting the channel. See you in the next episode. Goodbye, everyone.